All right, Mark Meckler is with us now. Welcome, Mark. How are you?
Good.
Good morning to you.
And miscommunication on my end here on time.
Oh, well. Now that you're here, it's great. You have big news to announce with the Convention of States project. What is it?
Well, so here's what happened. We now have surpassed 1 million petitions in support of the Convention of States project all over the country. Literally, petitions in every single state legislative district in the country. So that means 1 million folks have actually gone online, signed up, and said that they want their state legislators to ask for a Convention of States for the specific purpose of taking power away from Washington, D.C., and returning it to the people.
And you have three goals or three criteria, I guess, for this Article 5 convention. And what are those?
Yeah, the three things that the convention is intended to do is to address three things that the American people say is a really big problem. One is they want Washington, D.C. to get their fiscal house in order. So in a convention, delegates could talk about ideas to restrain the spending and the profligacy of Washington, D.C., maybe a balanced budget amendment, imposing generally accepted accounting principles on Washington, D.C., things like common sense stuff that Americans want, D.C. will never do. The second is anything that would take the power away from Washington, D.C. For example, I think people in Wyoming or, frankly, any state should have the right to decide how their kids are educated, and they shouldn't be told how to do that by the Department of Education. So we can tell the federal government you can't be involved in education or you can't be involved in the environment. States can handle these things on their own. So that would be the second, is to limit the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. And then the third one is term limits. Look, the Americans broadly, over 80% of Americans for the last 30 years say we should impose term limits on Congress. I also think, and we could talk about imposing term limits on the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary more broadly, and importantly, on the federal bureaucracy. This country was never intended to have this permanent bureaucratic class making millions of dollars off the backs of the American people. So those are the three subject matter areas we would talk about: fiscal limits, power limits, and then term limits on the federal government.
Okay, Mark, this begs a question. And believe me, I support all three of those. I think that's great. But our Constitution as it currently stands gives very specific and limited powers to the federal government, and the powers to the states are broad and undefined. Correct. Now, the Congress has ignored the Constitution. Let's say we have these amendments. How are you still going to enforce the Congress to obey? They've been disobedient for a century or more.
Yeah, and I think this is actually your question. I think is the best question. It was my question before I started this project, so I'm a little bit biased. But I think you and I had a misperception, and here's the misperception. What you're referring to when you say that they ignore the Constitution is you're referring to the original Constitution. You probably have a pocket version of this.
Yeah,
I do. It's a beautiful document. It's clear. It's well drafted. We understand exactly what it means. Sadly, that's a historic document. That's not our Constitution anymore. If you want to see what the Constitution is, you have to get it from the government printing office. The latest version was printed in 2012. I have one sitting here on my desk. It's 13 pounds. It's 2,738 pages without the more recent supplements. It's every case that's ever interpreted the United States Constitution. That tells us today what the law of the land is, what the Constitution actually means. And it contains all sorts of decisions that have done exactly the opposite of what you said, which I agree with, which is these limited enumerated powers that went to the federal government have now become broad and undefined because of over a century of Supreme Court decisions. That's the law of the land. On the spine, it actually says the Constitution of the United States of America. If we want to know what the law is, that's what we have to read now. And so Congress broadly follows that because it gives them almost infinite power. And the way the founders gave us to fix that is in Article 5, is calling a convention and taking those powers away from the federal government. And our history shows us we have 27 amendments, largely generally followed by the federal government. So our history shows us that the amendment process works in doing what we try to do with our amendment.
So the real enemy is, in some sense, this, I guess, case law that are merely expressions of opinions by various Supreme Courts, some of which are contradictory. In other words, one opinion contradicts a previous opinion. In many cases of that. So, well, that's a great explanation. I appreciate you enlightening me. I've got to get the 13-pound version. I didn't have that.
Yeah, I think everybody should see this thing. It's crazy. When I first got it, I was so stunned, and I would argue nobody's ever read it. I don't think anybody's ever read their way through that thing. Even if you did, it would be impossible for the average person to understand what's in that thing. And it belies a question, which I think is really interesting. If the Constitution is such a wonderful, beautifully drafted, clear document, which I think it is, why do we need 3,000 pages of text to explain it to us? Somebody is trying to tell us either one of two things. Either we're so stupid as a people that we can't understand this beautiful, cleanly drafted document, or the founders were so stupid that they drafted a document so obtuse it requires 3,000 pages. Neither of those things are true.